The people making decisions about our financial lives, from the apps we use to the policies that govern our economy, have never experienced what most of us go through with money. They exist in what is called the comfort class, and their disconnect from financial reality is literally reshaping how we think about money and manage money. So, today I want to talk about what this group of people is, how they got there, and why understanding this dynamic is really the key to understanding how policies work in America and also your own relationship with money. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. I think when most people hear the term class privilege, they picture trust fund kids or billionaire families, but the comfort class is much more broad. They might not necessarily be the top 0.1% of America, but they are this broader, wealthy group of people, and they're very powerful. And the key differentiator is that they are people who have never fundamentally had to worry about money. I want you to imagine a $1,200 emergency expense that hits tomorrow. Maybe it's a medical bill, car repair, whatever. For most Americans, that's a crisis. You are looking at credit cards, payment plans, other short term debt to kind of bridge the gap. And for somebody in the comfort class, maybe they're easily able to cover it themselves. Maybe they can text someone in their network, their mom and dad, problem solved. It's something that is just not a crisis to them. This security is what defines the comfort class. And here's how they kind of get there, right? People in this class graduate from college with little to no debt. Think about what that unlocks, right? When you're not making that $400 student loan payment each month, you can take that unpaid internship at the nonprofit. You can pursue graduate school without drowning in more debt. You can work in those prestigious but poorly paid fields like academia, policy work. And those industries design a lot of the financial policies we live with today, right? Meanwhile, if you graduated with 30,000 student loans, which is kind of the average in this country, you're probably taking whatever job pays the bills. Like that debt is going to make a huge amount of the calculus in how you make financial decisions going forward. And that means influential but potentially lower paying jobs, many of which shape our culture and our policies, get filled by people from the comfort class. But here's where it gets really interesting. Many of these people don't fully realize the privilege and power that they have, and there is a psychological reason for that. I think a lot of people are living through a sense of class dysmorphia, right? We have seen an explosion of millionaire, billionaire wealth. And I think that has made people feel relatively poor. It's shifted kind of the goalposts of what people consider uber wealthy. A recent study found that two-thirds of millionaires don't consider themselves wealthy. And there is macroeconomic factors for that, like inflation. But by and large, a millionaire in America is in the upper class, squarely in the upper class. And I think a lot of people, because of the vast wealth inequality in this country, it skews a reference group. So a lot of people relatively don't feel like they are ahead. And I think it's really important to think about that for a second, right? Like people with six-figure net worths are looking at billionaires and thinking, well, I'm just middle class. That creates a massive blind spot. When someone with $1 million portfolio is designing financial policy, they genuinely believe that they understand middle class struggles. But their version of middle class might be choosing between a vacation home or a private school tuition. Your version might be choosing between groceries and utilities. And when everybody calls themselves middle class, from the social worker whose parents bought her house to the software engineer with stock options, this term becomes meaningless, right? Which means policies supposedly designed for the middle class miss their target entirely. So who exactly is running the show? Who is shaping these financial policies that affect how we manage and have access to money in this country? I want to take a look at the numbers. More than half of Congress members are millionaires. So the people that are passing tax policy, deciding things like student loan forgiveness, they are debating policies that affect lives that in a lot of cases they have not lived. University presidents who oversee tuition rates and financial aid, they often make millions per year and sit on boards dominated by other multimillionaires and corporate CEOs. These are the people deciding the cost, how much potential debt you could be taking on for your education. And I'm not saying that these people are not altruistic and are not thinking about the greater good, but when you are at a certain level of wealth, you fundamentally do not understand how somebody in a different position lives. And if these are the people that are selling the policies that affect how the bottom 70% live, that becomes problematic because they have not gone through that lived experience, right? Think about policy centers, even in newsrooms, which shape how we talk about economic issues, right? Often come from top tier elite colleges, people that are not in the bottom 50% of income brackets, right? Or in tech, the people designing your banking apps, investment platforms, financial tools, a lot of times they come from backgrounds where financial stress has never been on their radar, right? And I think that explains why, because they haven't lived in a period of financial anxiety, they don't know how to design tools that actually meet people where they are at and actually can help them. And here's where this gets really problematic. These are not just abstract power dynamics. This disconnect is creating real world policy failures that affect your daily life. If you think about something called the vibe session, which is a term coined by Kyla Scanlon, and it basically explains how economic indicators can look great on paper, but people feel terrible about the economy. It explains that disconnect. Economists will point to things like rising GDP, low unemployment, but they miss the kind of underlying feelings people have about the economy where they're stressed about grocery prices and housing costs. They feel like no matter how hard they work, they can't get ahead. They feel like the American dream has completely kind of broken down, right? So the people analyzing the economy are looking at these kind of hard numbers instead of thinking about how these trickle down into the average person's lived experience. Or even think about financial literacy education. Most programs focus on teaching budgeting and just how to invest, the basics. But if you are living paycheck to paycheck, hearing save 6 months in an emergency fund is not helpful to you, point blank. The problem is not that you don't understand these concepts. The problem is that you do not have enough money left over to even action on things, right? Student loan policies are another perfect example. The people that are designing repayment programs and forgiveness criteria often went to college when it was either a fraction of today's prices, had family help, or both. So a lot of times they're creating systems that assume borrowers have the same flexibility that might not exist for that person. Even something as basic as overdraft fees reveals this disconnect, right? Banks design systems that maximize fee income from people who can least afford it. I always say that being poor is unbelievably expensive when it comes to the cost of handling and borrowing money. And the reason behind this is a lot of the people making those decisions have never personally experienced the cascade effect of a single overdraft that has led to multiple fees, taking on more debt, more overdrafts, etc. And then there's the 2024 election. This dynamic helps explain something that confused a lot of political analysis when Trump won. Why economic anxiety trumped, pun intended, social issues for so many voters. If you've never had to worry about affording groceries, it's easy to prioritize other things. But if you are choosing between gas and food, those concerns feel poignant. They feel vital. And I think what Trump did is he didn't dismiss the economic anxiety that data said over and over again shouldn't exist. He exploited it. Meanwhile, a lot of Democratic strategists coming from backgrounds where, when they think about a recession, they just think about their portfolio taking a hit, not that they could lose their home. I think they really did fundamentally miss in the general election how people were actually feeling about the economy. And I think that's why the election result was what it was. So I want to talk about what all of this does to your brain, because the effects of financial stress and the feeling of disenfranchisement and the feeling like you are out of control of what's happening with your money and the broader economy, they aren't just emotional, they are neurological. Studies have found that working through financial difficulties affects your cognitive function almost as much as missing an entire night's sleep. We're talking about a temporary loss of 13 IQ points. Your ability to make good decisions, retain information, and just think clearly literally decreases when you're financially stressed. But what the comfort class does not understand is that this is not a character flaw or a lack of willpower. It's biology. When you are in scarcity mode, your brain prioritizes immediate survival over long-term planning. That's why somebody might choose a payday loan, even though they know it's probably not the best financial decision. When you need money for rent tomorrow, that interest rate is tomorrow's problem. Your time horizon is condensed from the next meal to the next day. It is very difficult to think about the future and broaden your horizons because you are so hyper-focused on just making it to the next hour, the next meal, the next day. When you need money for rent tomorrow, that interest rate is tomorrow's problem. And that's something that really frustrates me about the way that people talk about financial planning is if you are somebody who is living paycheck to paycheck or you are struggling financially just generally, your time horizon, how you think about your next financial decision gets unbelievably shrunk. You are thinking in terms of next hour, next meal, next day, next rent payment. You're not thinking about 5, 10 years down the road. And I think a lot of financial advice doesn't recognize that and doesn't realize how time constrained people feel. One of the great luxuries of having money is being able to think about the future. And again, I think a lot of policies are not designed with that in mind. And that explains why I think a lot of the people in the comfort class look at the behaviors of lower income people and just simply see it as poor financial decisions, individual decisions, instead of a broader systemic issue, right? They're making those judgments also from a completely neurological state, right? Their brains aren't flooded with stress hormones. They can think long term because their short term needs are secure. This creates fundamentally different beliefs about money. And these unconscious beliefs about money drive our adult behavior. If you grew up where food scarcity was real, money scarcity is real, you might hoard leftovers, so to speak, for life. If you grew up where money problems could always be solved, you might not develop that anxiety about financial risk. And that fundamentally changes how you think about money and how you act with money in the future. And this shows up in how different classes vote. The comfort class can often afford to vote their values because their survival is on the line. They can prioritize things like social justice, climate change, because they're not worried about making rent. And I'm not saying that lower income people necessarily don't think about these things when they're voting, but a lot of times they are focused, hyper focused on the present and issues that can affect their bottom line. And they don't have the luxury of often thinking beyond that. And I'm not saying that it's also not that these issues of climate change, social justice, democracy matter. It is the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? If you're worried about basic security, everything else feels like a luxury. And this isn't about intelligence or education. Some of the smartest people I know make financial decisions that seem completely irrational until you understand the psychological context they are operating from. And the real problem is so much financial advice ignores this reality. Traditional financial planning assumes you have emergency funds, stable income, and the cognitive bandwidth to optimize your money. It's designed by and for people who have never experienced true financial insecurity. So when you can't follow the advice, you think you're the problem. But in a lot of cases, the advice was never designed for your reality in the first place. So I want to bring this into 2025 because this dynamic is everywhere once you start looking for it. So if you take something like inflation and interest rates, inflation has been declining and it has been kind of sticking around 2.5 to 3% over the past couple months. Most economists would say this is good, right? But of course, that inflation is uneven and we're seeing it spike much, much higher in these essentials like housing costs, groceries, etc. And on top of this, wage growth for a lot of people has not kept up with that inflation. Those are two numbers that really reflect the actual lived reality of people beyond just kind of this like headline inflation rate. And I think it's important to kind of point out these disconnects because that is affecting how people feel about their money and, of course, the broader economy. Housing policy is also another perfect example. A lot of housing affordability solutions assume that people have good credit, stable employment, family support. If you think about like down payment assistance program, first time buyer credits, they are designed for people who are quote unquote like almost there financially. And if you're stuck in rent cycles because you can't save for a deposit while paying 50% of your income in rent, those programs are not built for you. Let's also talk about fintech apps. This is another great example. These tools a lot of times are, built under the guise of democratizing finance, but a lot of these apps assume that you have discretionary income. Budgeting apps assume that your problem is tracking spending, not having enough income to spend. Even roundup saving features that are on a lot of these apps are very well intentioned and work for some people, but a lot of times assume you have enough buffer in your checking account that rounding up won't cause an overdraft. A lot of times the people designing these tools come from backgrounds where the barriers to financial success are knowledge-based, not resource-based. So they build solutions for those knowledge gaps when for a lot of people, the real problem is a resource gap. So you might be wondering, what do you do with all this? How do you navigate a financial system that maybe wasn't designed for your reality? The first thing I always recommend is to understand that if traditional financial advice hasn't worked for you, it might not be your fault. A lot of advice assumes resources and stability that people don't have. You're not failing at your money necessarily. In a lot of cases, you might be succeeding in a system that wasn't built for you. The second thing I recommend is to get specific about whose advice you're taking. When you see someone give you financial advice, ask yourself, what's their background? Do they share kind of certain aspects with me? Have they experienced certain types of financial insecurity? And I'm not saying every financial expert needs to go through that to give good advice, but I think it's important to understand and potentially relate to the advice that you are taking. Because again, a lot of the people you see online that give financial advice, they don't know you. They don't know your situation. So understanding your situation, where you're coming from, and taking advice with a grain of salt is super important. It's all about contextualizing their advice within your experience. The third thing is to prioritize money psychology over financial optimization. Before you worry about maximizing your returns, focus on building psychological resilience. I think this is the key thing that so many people miss with their money. This might mean keeping cash in a low yield savings account because it helps you sleep at night. It might mean choosing the more inferior debt repayment strategy because it gives you quicker emotional wins. I always say the best financial plan is one that supports your psychology and that you can stick to over the long run. And that might not be the most optimized plan, right? Traditional advice might say certain things are suboptimal, but it's important to know what works for you. The fourth is to recognize that your money behaviors might be adaptive responses to real constraints. If you're struggling to save, it might not be a willpower problem. It might be that your income barely covers necessities or past financial trauma has retrained your brain to expect crisis. And understanding the psychology behind your behaviors is the first step to actually changing them. And finally, advocate for a better system. Vote for representatives who understand financial insecurity, support financial institutions that acknowledge people's economic reality, and choose apps and tools designed by people who get it or designed for people like you. Because here's the thing. Individual financial success is important, but that's not enough. We need systemic change led by people who actually understand what financial stress feels like. I want to end by saying the comfort class isn't evil, but their blind spots are shaping a financial system that doesn't work for most people. Understanding this dynamic won't magically fix wealth inequality, but it will help you make better decisions about your money. I think when you realize that a lot of financial advice comes from people who have not faced your lived challenges, you can stop blaming yourself for not following it perfectly. When you understand that financial stress literally changes how your brain works, you can design strategies that works with your psychology, not against it. If this video resonates with you, please hit the subscribe button. I am committed to exploring money psychology that actually makes sense for real people living real lives. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.